In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, by the way, was second cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. So you have these two. They're from New York State. Theodore Roosevelt was born in Manhattan, actually. The president usually associated with the emergence of the progressive era in 1901. But Roosevelt, Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt together, with Theodore Roosevelt's championing of trust busting and environmental conservation and support for workers and things like the Pennsylvania coal miners' strike, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's robust New Deal make the Roosevelts probably the most progressive presidents in American history. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt ran against Herbert Hoover, and Herbert Hoover was very much really the epitome of the sort of philosophy of the 1920s when it came to economics and American society. He was a believer in what he called rugged individualism, and this belief that the government's role, sort of like the Gilded Age, was to be more hands-off when it came to individuals and society, and to really ensure wealth and prosperity and health of large businesses and corporations, under the idea that eventually that economic prosperity would benefit all, it would trickle down. That was kind of Hoover's attitude. And so Herbert Hoover, like Calvin Coolidge before him and Warren G. Harding before him, did not really believe that the government had a role in sort of trying to ensure benefits or interests for individuals in the middle class or working class groups of people. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, will ultimately run far counter to that. And he ran against Hoover largely on the basis that Hoover was not doing enough to help the American people during the height of the Great Depression. Remember, 5,000 banks closed in the first 3 years, and with it they took people's life savings regardless of whether they were on the market or not. There's no protections to people's bank savings at this time. People do not have widespread access to unemployment or Social Security or other types of things. And Roosevelt will largely run on a progressive platform of dealing aggressively with the crisis of the New Deal. In 1932, Roosevelt and Hoover are sort of running this campaign against one another, and Hoover, of course, the incumbent. The incumbent usually, it's harder to unseat the person who's actually the president than not. So Herbert Hoover was trying to become a two-term president. In 1932, a group of unemployed World War I veterans went to the United States Capitol, Anacostia. Anacostia is a place near the Potomac River in the Washington's capital, in the capital of the United States, the general Washington, D.C. area. And in 1932, they were called the Bonus Army because these were all World War I veterans. These are people that had served and fought in the First World War. And they had bonuses that were due to be paid to them, but they weren't due to be paid to them for their service in the First World War until the beginning of the 1940s. Well, so many people, remember, unemployment across the country was 25%, and in some places as high as 50, even higher percent unemployment. So the Bonus Army, these people were out of work. They had no money. There was no Social Security. There was no unemployment. There was nothing to provide them their basic needs. And so these World War I veterans that became dubbed the Bonus Army went to Washington, D.C. They built a Hooverville community, a makeshift community outside of the government buildings in D.C. and basically demanded early payment of their bonuses. They wanted Hoover to come out there and say, look, I know your bonuses are not due for a number of years, but this is a desperate situation, so we'll give you the bonuses now so you can survive. Hoover's response to this, which very much sort of embodied the attitude of the presidents of the 1920s, with the kind of limited role of the government in the everyday lives of individuals, Hoover's response was basically like, We are not going to do that under any circumstance. And to make matters worse, he called in a young, to-be General Douglas MacArthur. Some of you might know General Douglas MacArthur for the Second World War in his fighting in places like Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and so forth. One of the architects of the American victory in the Pacific War during the Second World War. And also, of course, he became very famous, some might say infamous, during the Korean War. But imagine this. World War I veterans in the Capitol asking for early payment of their bonuses, and the President of the United States calls in basically the military, led by General Douglas MacArthur, to forcibly disperse the veterans, which MacArthur does with tear gas and basically how you might think of like SWAT teams, if you will. And they went in there and they pushed everyone out and they demolished the shanty Hooverville that existed there. Franklin Roosevelt, who you can see here signing some of the most important legislation of the New Deal after, you will not be surprised, he became president. Franklin Roosevelt was noted as saying that that moment elected him. Because how could a president survive the election with that kind of action, let alone an action against American Army veterans? So Franklin Roosevelt wins in 1932 in a pretty significant margin of victory. And he will begin in the first 100 days of his presidency a robust era of reform known as the New Deal. This is Roosevelt here, of course. Here is one of the very famous murals that kind of depict the work that Americans started to do during the New Deal in the 1930s out of an effort to sort of recover from this calamity in the American economy. And here you see, the picture is a little grainy, so I'm sorry about that, but here you see Roosevelt signing some of the landmark legislation associated with the New Deal. So what was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal? Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal centered on really three areas. It would be called the three R's: relief, reform, and recovery. And it begins in 1933. And the first area really to deal with here, all of the areas are sort of dealt with together, if you will. But you need to reform the system. There's a problem with the system, particularly with respects to the markets and the banks. And so FDR began a robust program of reform. And this reform focused on the banks and the stock market. So the first thing he does is he calls the national banking holiday. Basically what he did was he closed banks for a week. And the reason why, remember, 5,000 banks had closed since the Depression had begun. And this was threatening the collapse of the financial institutions of the country. And if the financial institutions of the country collapse, it would be very hard to recover, because eventually banks are needed for people to achieve loans, for homes, for any myriad of things. Banks have a very fundamental role to play in a successful economy. Roosevelt understood that. So to stop further banks closing their doors because they were going bankrupt, Roosevelt calls the national banking holiday. They close banks for a week. And in that period of time, they put together some of the most important reform legislation that relates to banks that have ever been created in American history, as well as to the stock market. And this was involved really the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act dealt with the issue of, first of all, banks playing on the markets. So one of the problems leading to the Depression were that commercial banks were basically engaged in the very risky endeavor of playing the stock market. Banks are businesses. They're trying to use your money to make more money and then to invest in greater and greater things. And so the problem, though, of course, was banks, commercial banks, the everyday banks that you might have your savings account in, were basically taking money and they were trying to build capital on the market. And when the market collapsed, those banks all closed with no sort of infrastructure or insurance system to protect people's wealth. This ban was on commercial banks until the 1990s, and it was removed from the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1990s during the presidency of Bill Clinton. And that was an action that was really highly problematic historically because the recession in 2008, actually part of it directly related to less regulated banking activity, particularly banks on commercial markets in risky sort of activities that threatened the solvency of those banks. So the removal of that ban was highly problematic, and historians noted this, but at the time, political leaders did not heed the sort of legacy and the lessons of this history. Another major reform here was the creation of the FDIC, which stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC is simple. It insures your savings. Today, in the 21st century, I believe the amount that they will insure is up to $250,000. So if you have $250,000 in your savings account in the bank, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation will insure that money. So if the bank closes and goes under, you will be insured protections. So the creation of the FDIC was really important. You can now, because one of the big problems here was that people didn't trust banks anymore. This is why a lot of folks who have great-grandparents or grandparents who lived through the Great Depression might remember having grandparents that were hiding money in strange places in the house. The reason is because they did not trust the banking institutions, because banking institutions in their lifetime had collapsed and people had lost everything. And so the FDIC's job was really to create confidence in the banks, to help create confidence in the banks by insuring people's savings. That if you invest in a bank, you put your money in a bank, I should say, that the federal government will insure that money. You will not lose everything if the bank collapses. The United States was also domestically taken off the gold standard. The gold standard refers to the fact that your money would be based in gold. So in the 1800s, for example, you could have taken a $5 bill, and you theoretically could have exchanged the $5 bill for that amount of value in gold. The U.S. went off of that, and the reason the U.S. went off of that is because if your money is backed in some kind of hard standard, something that has a limited quantity, so there's limited amounts of gold in the world, there's limited amounts of silver in the world. If you base the money that people possess and spend on something that's quantity is limited, then it will limit the ability of the United States to use capital to sort of invest in the consumer economy, if you will. So they went off the gold standard largely so that they could use controlled deficit spending, borrowing of money. They could effectively increase the money supply to fund the many things that were going to be carried out in the New Deal. And with the stock market, what they do with the stock market is create something called the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And what this body did was regulate the stock market. It's an oversight body. It's part of the federal government. Its job is to basically watch the stock market and to investigate activities that might be illegal or highly risky. And the goal there was to have an oversight body that was paying attention to what was going on in the stock market so you could find problems before they became calamities. Another major area was to provide relief. Americans need relief at this time. People have lost their jobs. Over a million people went homeless, basically, lost their jobs. Unemployment rates are skyrocketing. And so unemployment was really, really important part of relief. So the development of unemployment programs was very, very important. But in addition to a program of unemployment, the big part of this area of relief in the New Deal was really to put people back to work. Americans want to work. Americans want jobs. Americans want to work for an honest paycheck. When the stock market crashed, people weren't hiring lots of people again. They weren't hiring lots of people because the businesses were just trying to survive. So they had laid off millions of workers across the country, and there were not simply enough jobs to put people back to work. So the Roosevelt administration created robust work programs, working for the government on a myriad of programs. And these were things like the CCC, which stands for Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC did things like they built levees on rivers. They planted trees in the Midwest to act as wind buffers. They were involved in a myriad of national parks projects. These were young people, young men who were, you basically left, you joined the CCC, and you would have left your home, and you would have lived in sort of a military-style barracks, and you would have lived in this work camp, if you will, and then they would have worked and done things like restoration of national parks, or building levees, or planting trees in the Midwest to act as a wind buffer to prevent the blowing away of the topsoil. And then they would receive paychecks, and they could send the paycheck back home to their family, who would then have some money to live on. There were programs like the WPA, the PWA. These are similar. The Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration. And these bodies did things like they built, in some cases, baseball stadiums. There are minor league ballparks today that exist that were built from these programs. They built roads. There are parkways that are built in the United States by these groups. They built dams. The Grand Coulee Dam, the most impressive dam building project in United States history, was built by these programs. So they put people back to work, building the infrastructure, improving the infrastructure that had to be done. And in this sense, the government is paying them. They are using sort of controlled inflationary spending, deficit spending, to pay workers to work effectively for society and for the government as a whole, building and improving the infrastructure because the country needed that. And that provided a boost in employment, and it provided people also in the society a greater level of self-esteem as you're now working and earning and helping your family get back on their feet. The last big item, so again, the New Deal, reform, relief, recovery, is the recovery element, which is then associated more with your sort of what we might call safety net programs. They create Social Security. To this day, 7% of your paycheck is deducted and goes into your Social Security. And the idea with this was that this would be a government retirement, effectively. You would pay into Social Security. The Social Security that you pay into is not on the stock market, so it's not privatized. It's designed to be free of the fluctuations and instability of the stock market. So you pay into Social Security, and then when you reach retirement age, today it's 65, though it'll be going up to 67, I believe. But when you reach retirement age, you would then receive a Social Security check that is based on theoretically the amount of money you contributed to Social Security. And the idea here would be to provide people with money when they're not able to work. And connected to that was the creation of unemployment benefits. When workers went unemployed, they were able to apply for unemployment benefits, and states started to do this as well, and that the unemployment would help you survive when you were out of work. There were also a myriad of homeowners relief programs to help homeowners buy new homes. There was a massive run of foreclosures of farms and homes during the Great Depression. And so this was designed to provide low-interest, affordable mortgages so people could start buying homes again and help the country recover long-term.